Hi, I'm Adam from the Quality Improvement team, and this is the second of our mini video training modules. So what I want to talk about in this video is how you can use video conferencing software to deliver some of the quality improvement tools that we teach people about. The tool that I want to address specifically today is something that works quite well over video conferencing and that we use a lot in QI, and that's called process mapping. So a process is any activity where you carry out a series of actions in a sequence to achieve a desired outcome. In quality improvement, we have a standardized way of doing that, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So let's start by talking about the very basics of creating a process map. What we do when we're writing up a process map is to represent each individual part of the process as a square. Often people use post-it notes to allocate each of these squares, and then you link up each part of the process using an arrow. It's a convention that when you have a decision point in the process where two or more different lines could go off from that point, you use a diamond. Generally, people will record issues and opportunities as they arise while they're creating the map. And typically people use red squares for issues and green squares for opportunities. Quite often people also choose to use a number of different colours for the different steps in their process. So what I like to do, for example, is have blue for clinics and clinical activities, and then another colour for things like admin processes. Sometimes that might be yellow.
Now, because in a remote session we will be creating our process map digitally rather than on a piece of paper, we need to create all of the parts of the map using PowerPoint instead of paper. So here's what that might look like. We can add in the first point in our process using a blue square shape, and then connect it to the first decision point using an arrow. And then beyond that we can have further routes that our process can take, and then we can add in issues and opportunities with red and green squares. So before we move on to look at some more detailed examples, I think it's important to look at why process mapping is something that we do in QI and why it's a really valuable activity, because I'm aware this might look like quite a lot of effort. So one reason for creating process maps is that they allow you to identify points in the process that are causing delays further down the process and reducing activity levels, and we call these bottlenecks. Another reason for mapping out the process, and perhaps the most important, is that it brings everybody together in the room to discuss what the issues are, and because you're mapping out the whole process, that encourages people to comprehensively discuss all aspects of the work you do, not just the regular issues. Another benefit of process mapping is that they enable the understanding of what may be quite complex systems. So in the NHS, care pathways often link in with a number of different services and have points where they connect through referral in and out, and for outsiders to be able to understand this when they're working with a service, it's very helpful to have it mapped on one page. Also, when mapping out a service in its entirety, sometimes you'll identify things which haven't been scrutinised for a long time and are actually somewhat outdated or no longer serving their purpose, and so there might be things that you can stop doing. So if we use an everyday example such as going to get a coffee, here's how it might look mapped out as a process digitally. So we make our decision to get a coffee, and then we can decide whether or not we want to invite somebody to come with us. There's a decision point. There might be an opportunity to access a discount at the cafe, and then we can go down one decision or the other, whether to bring our friend or go directly to the cafe. Then we queue. Then we come to our next decision point, which is choosing what drink to buy, and then dependent on what drink we buy, we'll have slightly different processes for preparing the drink for ourselves. Whether you might want to add milk or sugar could depend on whether you're having a cappuccino or, for example, a frappuccino. Now, this everyday example might make it all look fairly straightforward, but of course we're talking here about facilitating process mapping remotely with a live group of people, so you do need to be able to do it quite quickly, and I'm going to share some tips about how to do that. So you may have noticed that my coffee buying process map kind of snaked around the page. Usually in process mapping in a classroom we'll use a really long piece of paper. In PowerPoint you'll need to adjust the page settings to create one long slide so that the whole map will fit in. In order to be able to build the map quickly enough in a remote session, I find it really helpful to use keyboard shortcuts. You can use them to do the basic stuff like copy pasting the objects on the page, and you can also use keyboard shortcuts to insert and format the shapes that you'll be using quite a lot of, and this is also helpful. One other PowerPoint function which is helpful to be aware of when facilitating sessions remotely is that when you connect shapes together using arrows, if you join them at the red dots in the corner, then when you move that shape, subsequently the shapes will move together and you don't have to move each one individually. Now, when facilitating sessions remotely, it's inherently a little bit more difficult to communicate with the group, so we'd suggest to prepare as much as possible in advance of the session. This might include things like sending out an FAQ which answers predictable questions such as, are we going to get the presentation slides? And you could also send out some group instructions for everyone around things like muting your microphone, thinking about the space where you're sitting during the session, and anything else that you think people need to be aware of. And by doing this, we can ensure that as much of the session as possible can be used for the actual process mapping. I've found that it's also helpful to have a template prepared in advance with some of the items I'm expecting to use in the process map, and we can share those if people are going to have a go at this themselves. Also, you may want to agree with the group the level of detail they want to capture and whether they want to talk about roles and timings. For example, here is a template that we prepared of a swim lanes process map, and that's an approach to process mapping where you capture different channels of the process map on different layers of the page, but you could equally start with a blank page if you prefer to do it that way. So let's look now at some of the practicalities of actually delivering the session when the people are there. So you've got your attendees remotely joining the session via video conference. We found it's best to have two facilitators, one to communicate with the group and then a second person to actually write up the contributions on the process map via a shared screen. When sharing a screen in a video conferencing session with a lot of detailed information on it, it is a good idea to consider whether people will be able to read everything, and you might want to adjust the size of the cursor so people can follow what's going on. There does also seem to be a consensus that when working remotely in this way, it's a good idea to keep the subject matter under discussion simpler, because it's not going to be as easy for everybody to chip in and contribute. Therefore, agreeing in advance to keep certain things out of the scope of the discussion for time's sake can be a helpful thing to do. As I mentioned previously, one of the major benefits of process mapping is that all members of the team have an opportunity to contribute to the building of the map. However, this can be trickier in a video conferencing environment, so it's really important to direct people to use the functions of that software to alert when they have a question to ask or contribution to make. We've also found it helpful to pause the whole session at regular intervals and ask the group if anyone has a contribution that they weren't able to make at an earlier stage. Now we're going to show some excerpts from a real process mapping session that we did remotely with a team here at esht to give an impression of what all of this might look like in practice.
And Adam will have on the screen PowerPoint, and he will be typing up what you say onto a little image of a post-it note and posting it onto the screen. And then we'll have to make sure we get them in the right order. We would be interactive normally, we'd be moving around the room, we'd probably have a whiteboard that people could write things on, we'd have a flip chart people could write things on, we'd have the process map on the screen, on the wall, people would be moving around with their post-it notes, and it would be a very different session from this. But we can use Adam as our wall and our post-it notes, and we can use the chat as our way of recording issues, opportunities for doing things differently, etc. So if we just, anybody type anything there, that will be recorded, and Adam and I can go and look at that afterwards and use it.
Can everyone see the shared screen now? It should be a wide PowerPoint slide.
Yep.
Yep.
Great.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is, as everybody's speaking, I'll try to enter what would conventionally be process maps as little icons on the screen.
Our current pathway and how we've locked down means we're missing the asymptomatic. This pathway mapping for symptomatic MSMs, then we'll be able to see what happens to them as they go forwards from telephone reception triage into a nurse triage. And does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is there anything else that needs to come onto this pathway that we haven't got at the moment in terms of what you do, or in terms of issues or opportunities or areas for taken us almost exactly an hour?
And something also to be aware of is that there's a number of other QI activities and tools that can be also facilitated using the same principles described in this video. So to sum all of this up, here's a process map of how to create a remote process map. So prepare in advance by sending out instructions and agreeing aspects in advance if you can. Start the session with an introduction so that people understand what they're working on and perhaps have a group agreement digitally. Agree about the detail level, the start and end point. Maybe start with a template in advance that helps you to facilitate the session, and then do all of the work to create the map, stopping at regular intervals to check for additional contributions for the group, and then follow up for any further contributions after the session, do some additional formatting and send out the final version to the attendees.
So that concludes video 2. As always, if you have any comments or feedback on the video, please send them to our team email address, and we'll see you again in module 3.